What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Thought Leader Podcast. I am your host, Dylan Barr, and this is our sixth episode where we interview past and current thought leaders in the space of health, wealth, and relationships in hopes of reaching past, current, and most importantly, aspiring future thought leaders, people that have a message in their heart or a mastery in their mind, and they're looking at getting it out to the world, but they're at that comfort/uncomfort precipice. We hope to interview people and understand their story and understand what they have to teach us, to hopefully reach you and give you that little nudge to get outside that comfort zone and get your message out to the world. Today, we are going to be speaking in the realm of relationships. This is actually our first podcast where we talk about relationships. We've talked about health, we've talked about wealth, now relationships, and we are going to be speaking with the ever awesome Audra Rutnik. A little bit about Audra Rutnik. She is a pediatric occupational therapist turned parent coach. She specializes in sensory processing and how it affects behavior and learning in kids. After years of watching her own daughter struggle with sensory processing difficulties, she found a calling working with young children with developmental challenges. And after years of studying the brain, she noticed there are 4 patterns of behavior that are directly correlated with how well a child is processing sensory information. We're going to talk about her 4-level framework today, and we're going to learn how a child's response to stress inhibits their ability to react appropriately. I'm super excited. Audra, welcome to the Thought Leader Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, it has been fun working with you inside of Thought Leader in our Business Accelerator program, which I forgot to tell you, we are going to talk about slightly in today's podcast. So those listening, stay tuned. But I start every podcast with this question because it's called the Thought Leader Podcast. And I think that word thought leader is very subjective. It means something different to every single person that hears it. So for you, what does it mean to be a thought leader?
I think for me, it means being able to, speak about something that's near and dear to my heart. I think that being a thought leader is taking all of my past experience, both personal and professional, and building on that and helping people understand my take on my experience, like I said, both personal and professional, and as well as building on top of the current knowledge that's already out there on the topic. We look at behavior with children, and there's so much to learn. And when we can each take our own perspective and apply it to information that's already out there, and we can create something new, it's like new sprouts of information. So being able to get that out there in a way that helps people is what it means to me to be a thought leader.
I love it because it's a mix of, and it's one of the things that we say, it's a message that's either in your heart or in your head. So it's, you have this deep passion in your heart. There is information that's out there, but as you go through it with your own experience, you're able to add on and layer to that knowledge to then help other people. And then it's having the gumption, love that word, one of my favorite words, to go ahead and get it out there, which we're going to talk about in today's podcast. But I'm a big storyteller. I love the power of story. I think the power of story shapes history. And I think every thought leader has that inciting incident to their story, right? We talked about it in the intro where you saw, signs or potential challenges with your daughter going through some of these difficulties growing up. So I'd be curious, what were you doing before this? You can kind of walk us through what were you doing before this? And then what happened? Like, what did you start to see? And then why the shift for you to go into this journey?
When my daughter was 3, she's now 23, so we're talking 20 years ago, sensory processing wasn't mainstream. It wasn't a term that most people knew, let alone understood. And it wasn't until I'd say the past decade, maybe a little more, that neuroscience has really done a good job of teaching us how the brain processes information. And back then, I remember struggling every day trying to navigate the challenges of raising my daughter who had sensory processing issues. I didn't know that even existed. Sensory processing wasn't a term that was in my vocabulary back then. I searched everywhere for answers, doctors, I searched everywhere,
Mhm.
and most people told me it was me. Family members said, "You're just not tough enough. You need to discipline her more." And I just knew there was something more going on with her. She was struggling with something, and it killed me as a mom to not be able to help her. And I started to think it was me, that maybe everyone's right. Maybe it is my parenting. And I finally found someone when I sought out a therapist.
Mhm.
She said, "Audra," she said, "it's not you. You're doing everything right. Your daughter has sensory processing challenges." And I was like, "Sensory what?"
Yeah.
So from there, you know, everything unfolded. I went to school to become an occupational therapist after seeing how occupational therapy helped my daughter. Um, since then, I've really just been obsessed. I've been obsessed with how the brain works, how we process sensory information. And as I started working with children, like you said, I saw those 4 patterns of behavior that I started recognizing
Mhm.
in my work, and I realized, you know what? There are people that parents don't understand this. How can I make it simple for parents
Yeah.
to understand?
Yeah, it's almost once you see things over and over again, it becomes easier to put them into a framework, right? And we're going to talk about that in a minute here. But 2 decades ago, this being a brand new concept, you thinking it's you having other people say, "Hey, this could be you," but this intuitive knowing to say, "I'm going to keep chatting with people."
Yeah.
You talk to a therapist who helps you. You become so infatuated with what she did that you want to go into the same thing. I'm curious then, as you started to go down this path and learning more about sensory processing in kids, what were some of the first things that you learned that kind of went against the grain of what the public would say? Because, like you said, I mean, sensory processing still feels like a new concept for me. We're talking two decades ago.
Yeah.
What seemed to go against the grain in what you were learning versus what society kind of put out there?
Well, first, I think that, 20 years ago, there were a lot of doctors and people in the medical profession that didn't even think sensory processing was a thing. They thought it was just made up.
Hmm.
And so the first thing is that sensory processing isn't just a diagnosis, and it is not just a strategy we use to regulate children. Sensory processing is how every single human being experiences and responds to their world. So we take in information through our senses, right? Our brain then has to process and make sense of that information, and then we respond. And that's when I started seeing, wait, that response is our behavior, right? So, in that light, how can you not see that behavior is a direct reflection of how well someone is processing, and not just sensory information, but emotional information as well?
That's really fascinating. When you can break it down that simply, it's inputs are what our senses pick up, outputs is our behavior and how we react to it. So it's really what it sounds like is being able to help understand so you can then help each person who does it differently, that shift of
Yes.
inputs coming in, behavior or outputs coming out. Is that it?
Yeah. Yes. And the other thing is the behavior. I teach parents how to take how they look at behavior, the traditional behavior model, put it on a shelf, and understand that behavior is nothing more than information. And if we learn what it means, we can then learn how to better respond to it and help our children build the skills so they learn to behave well in the first place.
Yeah, because you talk about, I mean, I'm lucky enough to get to work with you personally within Thought Leader. You talk about behavior isn't just good or bad. Is it exactly what you're saying there, or is there more to it where it's just information?
Well, when we look at behavior as good or bad, it goes under the assumption that we think the child can do better. But
Mhm.
really, if a child's having a tantrum or behaving poorly because they can't have a cookie or a toy, or it's time to turn the TV off because it's bedtime, that's just an expectation we're placing on them that they're not emotionally ready to meet. We aren't born with sensory processing skills, emotional regulation skills. They have to be taught. So when we look at behavior as just good or bad, we're actually saying that, oh, the child is good or bad. And
Yeah.
it's easy for the child to internalize that too.
So what would be the differences? I actually follow your TikTok. I love your TikTok where you tell stories of some of the children that you work with and the challenges they're having, let's say, with their parents or with their teachers. And then when you come in, what do you really, if you could toot your own horn a little bit here, right? What do you feel is different about your approach to managing children's behavior through this knowledge that you have?
Yeah. So First, I want to say I'm mostly on Instagram right
Oh, yeah,
now,
yeah.
but I'm getting going on TikTok as well. So just so if people are looking, I just
It's
wanted to clarify that just in case someone's looking.
it's crazy
But
that TikTok's become like a verb of their own, where it's like now TikToks
it's
and
like
Reels.
tissue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I would say that I look at the front end behavior.
Mhm,
The traditional behavior model looks at the ABCs of behavior:
mhm.
antecedent, which is the trigger, the behavior itself, and then the consequence. And that consequence, usually we give either a positive or negative reinforcement to try to either promote or negate a future behavior. But that focuses on the back end of behavior after it occurs. And that's going under the assumption that the child knows what to do instead. So it's easy to tell a child, don't talk to me that way, or ignore a tantrum. But what are they supposed to do instead? So my approach goes on the front end of behavior. And after I find the trigger of what's prompting it, what's upsetting the child, then we work on what skills what does the child not have to produce a good behavior, the positive response. So we build those foundational skills that allow children to behave well in the first place.
And I think a big part of what you talk about is more of the stress that can come into it. So, and
Yes.
I would have one of the things that you and I were talking before this podcast started is there's got to be stress of the child that impacts the behavior, and there's also got to be stress in the arena that they're in,
Yeah.
whether that's school or whether that's home. I want to talk specifically about the home in a second, but how does because what I'm really hearing is you follow this whole process of kind of witnessing as information comes in, then witnessing almost how the child is digesting it
Mhm.
before we can understand how they're reacting to
Yeah.
it, right? So, how does stress, if we get down to the nitty gritty, where and how does stress impact that process for a child?
It's just like us when we are stressed, our sympathetic nervous system kicks on. And that's just basically our fight flight response.
Hmm.
So when we're stressed, think about going into a test,
Hmm.
right? When you can study for a test all you want and you can know every single bit of information that you have, you're going to go in acing the test. But as soon as you walk in, you get nervous, you feel that fear, you feel that anxiety. All of a sudden, your stress response starts to kick on. And when that occurs, it actually turns off the part of our brain that accesses logic and reasoning. So it actually dulls and mutes our neural processing so we can't access the information we're looking for. It's there, we have it, we just lose access to it. So when you couple that with punishing a child when they do something wrong and you're yelling at them and they're punishing and, oh, you're getting this taken away, or you can't have this until you behave this way.
Hmm.
Well, if they can't do it, and now they're associating that stress of the adult being angry at them, yelling at them. We talk to children with our facial expression, our tone of voice, our body language, the words we speak. And all of a sudden, they start to internalize that. Now, for one thing, now they think they're bad, not what they
Yeah.
did was bad. And on top of that, they can't access their logic and reasoning skills in that moment, so they're not able to learn the lesson we're trying to teach them at all anyway.
Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So I always say to parents, just put the traditional model aside. Let's look at their behavior,
Hmm.
identify what level it falls in, and I have that framework which helps parents do that easily. And then you can follow it like a roadmap to say, okay, when they're in this level, this is how I need to approach them to get the expectation met. Can they do it on their own? Do they need a little bit of assistance? Do I need to give them a moment and back off to let their processing catch up? And then once a parent can identify this and learn how much support to give them at any given moment in time, then they can learn to support the child so the child can learn the skills to be more successful, whether it's homework, following a daily routine, or even discipline.
Yeah. So I want you to correct me if I'm wrong here as I try to, understand this. You've got 2 decades of experience here. I'm catching up. The stress that can be put on a kid as they're going through taking in information, digesting, and then reacting to a situation. That stress, for to me, feels like it would really disrupt that digestion part of taking information in
Yeah.
because, like you're saying, brain is in fight or flight, not analyzing like logically what's happening so they can respond.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it's parents add to the stress when all we do is say, man, you're being bad, or great job, good boy, bad boy, or good girl, bad girl in a
Yes.
sense, which then adds to the stress, which makes it harder. So it's almost like we're layering. First there's stress, and then when we say bad or good, now we're layering more stress with that. Kid's like, I have to digest this the right way, which of
Yes.
course makes it harder for them. Am I getting that?
Yeah, and a good example is I work with some children with ADHD.
Mhm.
And children with ADHD, it's not an attention deficit. It's not a deficit of attention. It's a deficit to focus on one thing. They can't, like you and I were talking right now. I can rule out any background noise, or my brain knows what not to pay attention to. That's
Mhm.
part of processing,
Mhm.
tuning out what we don't need, being able to focus on what we do need, process the information to make sense of it so you and I can just have a conversation, right? So when you have a child who can't sit still and they're constantly being told, sit still, sit still. Oh my gosh, he's not, he's not doing his work. He's not completing his task. He's bumping into the kids. He can't stop moving. He's disruptive. And we hear this all the time. And that's something that the ADHD child can't control. And now he's getting in trouble for it or constantly being reprimanded and told what to do. And it's something that he can't physically do. Now he starts to internalize that I'm not as good as everybody else. I can't do this because children don't understand that, you know, their brain is different and
Yeah.
it's
Wait,
processing
other
different.
people don't have this, what I have going on in my brain?
Yeah.
Now, I noticed, I'll be very curious, a personal question here, and don't have to answer if you don't want to. When you're describing that situation in ADHD, you're like, yeah, he can't do this, he can't do this. With your time in the field, do you tend to see when parents or teachers are having a difficulty with a child with ADHD? Does it tend to lean more to the young boys or young girls, or do you find like there's like that kind of healthy split?
You see it presents differently
Yeah,
in boys and girls, but I see it mostly in boys.
yeah,
And again, the teachers, they have a room full of 20 children, and not all, every single person in their classroom learns differently,
yeah.
right? Every child processes differently. Every child has something different going on. So, kudos to teachers. They have their hands full with 20 different, and how do you teach and give each child what they want? But at the same time, I wish we didn't try to fit all kids into the same square peg, into that same hole, and learn to recognize and maybe create a different environment, because every child, I don't care whether you have a diagnosis or not, every child is brilliant in their own right. They all have their own passions. They all have what they're good at. So instead of constantly telling a child what not to do, let's find what their passion is. Let's teach them what they want. We want them to do instead. And
Yeah.
one more thing, Dylan, I wanted to mention that I don't think I didn't mention before when we were talking, is about neural connections.
Mhm,
We can change our brain. Our brain, think of it like a road, right?
mhm,
We behave a certain way subconsciously. It's automatic. Most of our behavior is automatic. It doesn't require conscious thought. So if a child is told something and they get anxious and stressed and don't know how to emotionally process that, then maybe their knee-jerk reaction is this way, right? And every time they respond negatively to that trigger, then it builds that pathway stronger and stronger and stronger until it becomes so automatic that the child's negative behavior that we're trying to get rid of, they can't stop if they wanted. It has too much momentum.
mhm.
So if we stop before, and this is where I'm different too, is where we get just to the point of that frustration. Watch the child, learn their little tell signs. Watch when they're getting to that point of frustration, interrupt that stress response before it takes off automatically, rewire the brain. And you can't rewire a new neural connection until you actually live the experience. So it's not enough to tell a child, don't do that. You have to then tell them what to do instead.
Mm,
And you can take it one step further and say, now let's practice that. Let's try that again. Go back to where you were frustrated, and what can you do instead of throwing the toy? How can you use your words and tell me? Now we've just created a new neural pathway. Then I spend the time constantly bringing them along that neural pathway.
yeah, I remember, you, in one of your Instagram reels, you talk about a young girl like in a playground, and how
Yes.
you actually had like the teachers, like it was a challenge, or I think she got in a fight, and you kind of went and had the full conversation so she could see what she was doing the whole time, and then offering that new solution. I absolutely love it. Now, is there from what you've learned, does every kid have completely different ticks or reactions to stress,
Sure.
or does
They
it
all do.
is there any that seemed like, I'm trying to think of a parent potentially listening to this. Is there anything they could keep their eyes out for before we get into the four frameworks? Is there anything that they could, like those first signs that they could look for their kid, or
The 4 levels of
Mhm,
the framework actually that's what they are. It allows you to identify. So if, like I have some children that they look away.
mhm,
I mean, look at us. If we were talking and I was going on and on and on and on and on, and I started seeing you go like this, I know your processing is starting to slip. We all have our own tells.
mhm.
But once you understand the framework, you can identify your child's tell in a heartbeat.
Okay, so then let's go there then. And if, by the way, if you see me look this way, these are some of the questions I want to ask you. I promise I'm still in. Uh, because I'm a big believer of frameworks help us, kind of make sense of this chaotic world. Sometimes we need a box to think inside so we can then think outside the box. I'd love to learn, like from a parent's perspective, that might have a child that is going through some sensory behaviors, that seem difficult. We'll just say not wrong or right, not bad or good. What are these four levels that you talk about of how they can understand when it hits and then help rewire it, as you would say?
I like to say that the 4 levels are directly correlated with sensory processing as I've laid them out here.
Hmm.
And so, level 4, before I talked about when we take in information, we process it to make sense of it, and then we respond appropriately.
Hmm.
That's a level 4.
Hmm.
So, that's when you could give a child an expectation, "Hey, go get ready for school."
Hmm.
They hear you, they process, they know what they're supposed to do, and they go do it, right? There's no
Hmm.
distraction, they don't get frustrated, whatever. Level 3 is when they might need a little prompting, right? They're taking in the information, they're processing it, but maybe they can't carry out the task. Maybe they go get their shoes and their bag, but they forget their coat,
Hmm.
and they're like, "What?" And we're like, "I said go get ready." But really, just give them the prompt, because the fact that usually they can do it and now they can't, maybe they just need a little more assistance. So give them, either increase the support you give them by maybe a little reminder, or decrease the expectation and tell them only 2 things to do at a time, or whatever their just right challenge is. Those 2, children are pretty independent. I call that the upstairs brain. Dr. Dan Siegel is wonderful. He's one of my mentors from way back. I read all of his stuff, and he talks about the upstairs and downstairs brain. So my framework fits into that upstairs and downstairs brain, where level 3 and 4, where processing is happening, we're able to access our cortical brain, our thinking brain. Below that, we kind of get into our limbic brain, that emotional brain, or, even lower levels. And that's when we start to shut down. And that's when we have to back off expectation. Otherwise, if we notice a child is going down into a level 2 in their processing, and we miss the signs, they're looking away, they're getting frustrated, they're making the face, they're starting to talk back, whatever it is, and we keep the expectation at a level 3 or a 4, they're gonna dump into a level 1 and meltdown. It's just gonna happen.
Mm, mm. So with it again, one, two, three. I'm the layman of this podcast where I'm trying to take in information, process it, act on it. If they are doing all of that, level 4, if they're taking in information, processing it, and getting most of the task that's been asked, or they're supposed to do in that situation, level 3. And the way that we can work with it is maybe give them one or two less things to focus on.
Mhm.
Level 2, what I'm hearing is there's a disruption in the processing, which of course then disrupts the follow through. And then level 1, kind of pure meltdown, where it's like almost a complete block when it comes to information coming in. And that's when meltdowns occur.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's when, based on this framework, that's when meltdowns occur. And, it's funny because I often tell parents, as they get into, we talk about dysregulation, right? A lot
Mhm,
of parents understand the word dysregulation, but what does it actually mean? for me, in my framework, and when I talk about sensory processing, it's when they can't manage the expectation and they're starting to slip into a level 2.
Mm.
And so they're getting dysregulated. And from a sensory processing perspective, I like to teach parents 2 buckets of dysregulation. Either the child doesn't have the neurochemistry running through their brain to make all the neural connections so we can process efficiently.
Mhm.
So they need to kind of stop at the gas station, I say, which is a sensory break. Get up, move. Movement, all different kinds. I won't get into all of that, but gives us the neurochemistry to our brain so we can continue processing well. The other thing I like to say is the other bucket is like a traffic jam.
Mhm.
It's when too much is coming in and our brain can't keep up with it, so it gets bogged down and we shut down. It's
Mm.
kind of like clicking the computer mouse over and over, and the computer just gets jammed up,
Yeah.
because that's what our brain is. It's just a magnificent processor.
Yeah. So that was the next question. You already did it. The next question being like, how do you kind of help the children that are stuck at that level too? So it's either get up, kind of move the body because we're
Yeah.
being a little tight here, or that could be what the kid can do, or from the parent standpoint is let's stop clicking the mouse. Let's
Yeah.
stop giving so much information. It's almost what I've heard in the past from someone is like, let's go slow now so we can
Yeah.
speed up later. But it's slow down that information that's coming in because it's causing this blockage or tightness for the child.
Really quickly, I'll put that into an example so parents can understand it. Going back to the little girl that I told you about on the playground, right?
Mhm.
When she wasn't being allowed to play, some kids weren't letting her play. And so she pushed a little girl down. She went into 1. She couldn't manage the expectation. She was angry. She pushed the little girl down level 1. She ran off. Now, the teachers obviously are like, want to reprimand her for hitting and
Mhm.
pushing. But you can't reprimand until you're upstairs. You can't
Mhm.
reprimand until you're up in 3 or 4. So I stepped in and I just first acknowledged and validated where she was. First, we are human beings. We have to be acknowledged and validated. Our feelings matter. Her feelings mattered. She didn't just do it for the fun of it. Something was wrong. And so I said, what's wrong? And she couldn't answer because what's wrong is a level 4 question. So I said, you look mad. I just acknowledged where she was at. She was in a level 1. I backed off all expectation and didn't ask her any questions. I just validated. And I said, you look like you're angry. It's okay to be mad. I get mad too sometimes. And she kind of softened. Now I have her in a level 2 because now she's connected with me.
Mhm.
And I said, do you need a hug or do you want to come here and tell me? And she kind of slowly walked towards me like, oh, here's an adult who's not yelling at me.
Mhm.
And so I opened myself up to her and acknowledged her as a human being first. And she came over to me and I said, are you upset? And she said, yes. Now she's communicating with me. So she's in a level 3. And I just bring her up the levels with certain things that I do. And that's what the framework teaches. Once she gets back up to level 4, that's when I can say, okay, what happened? And then teach the lesson. And
Yeah.
that's when you're going to get a genuine apology from a child, not when we force it when they're in level 1 or 2.
Yeah, because if you're just basically asking to say apologize for what you did, it's an emotional whatever, I guess I'm sorry because they're in this level 1. So your whole teaching and your whole working with kids and parents and teachers is just slowly going through the levels. You don't go from level 1 to level 4. You don't go from 2 to 4. You don't go from 1 to 3. It's 1, 2, 3, 4.
You can go from 4 and drop to a 1 really quick.
Sounds like it.
But when you are going up, and every time, remember I said that new neural pathway, every time we acknowledge and validate, put out that fire in level 1, connect with them, level 2, start communicating with them and giving them, did you do this or that? Maybe a choice of 2 so they can help process what happened and process their emotions. Because she was 3.5. She didn't understand how to express to me emotionally what happened. So I
Right.
was giving her choices and I was building that neural pathway and helping her process the information.
Hmm. I fascinated by this. I'm always fascinated by this. And I'm curious, so before I ask my next question, we're going to get to kind of the last portion of our call here. I'd love to know what you do and why you've decided to get uncomfortable. But before we do that, let me talk to the listener real quick. This podcast, for anyone that is curious, is brought to you by Thought Leader, an Aspired based company. Over the last 8 years, this company has made it a mission to help its coaching and consulting clients get their authentic message out to the world in hopes of reaching their own desired audience through the power of speaking and business building. With over 650 clients landing TEDx talks around the world, hundreds more speaking on virtual and physical stages, Thought Leader has perfected the art of delivering a top-tier message. They also offer programs to build and scale your own high-ticket program and authentically market and sell it to your target audience. We're chatting with one of those clients here today, Audra Rutnik, and how you can build a sustainably scaled business. If you have a message in your heart or mastery in your mind and you wish to share it with your desired audience, click the link in the description to learn more about Thought Leader and watch Taylor Conroy's free webinar today. Audra Rutnik did that. She came into the program. She shifted this to becoming a parent coach, as you say now. So that is a question that I'd have for you is there could be moms, dads, grandparents that are watching their kids out there that are like, this is cool. I need to know more about this. Kind of two questions. One, where do people find you? And two, who is it that you work with? Now, I've heard parent coach. We've heard the situation at schools. Like, do you work with parents? Do you work with teachers? How do people find you? And who do you work with?
So I work with parents who are mostly overwhelmed with navigating the challenges of raising children who have struggles of any kind, whether they're behavior struggles, sensory processing struggles, developmental challenges. But more often than not, it's by the time it gets to the behavior that they can't, the traditional behavior model and traditional behavior strategies just aren't working. They feel lost and they don't know where to turn. And those are the people I'm talking to because I was that person 20 years ago. And I wanted to create something that would have helped me 20 years ago. So I've created it for people now to give back.
So,
And yeah.
and where people find you?
I'm on Instagram mostly right now. That's
Mhm.
my main platform. However, I am starting on TikTok, and I also have people can subscribe to my email list to get weekly content where I go a little deeper than you can on Instagram and do some more teaching there as well.
Perfect. And we'll put all of those links in the description here on YouTube for those that are listening, as well as we'll put them on our own social platforms. But really, what it sounds like is I'm a dad or I'm a mom, and I'm starting to see these like small meltdowns for my kid, right? I'm just going to use the words that I'm probably seeing meltdowns. There'll be bad behavior. I can't seem to break it. What the heck do I do? I've tried everything. You're the one that's helping them so we can start to develop these new neural pathways for the kids, slow down and be able to work and operate within a framework so we can start to rewire the brain to get to that upstairs level 4 in your framework. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes.
Amazing. Now, last questions. This is where it comes to the uncomfort part of what you've done. I can imagine, could be wrong, it can be difficult to get this message out to the world. I know on TikTok, you told me going through our program, it's like you get a lot of people that give you comments of loving this and other people giving you comments like, well, that's not how I do it. That's not how I was raised. Like, we don't need to go into the exact stories and what people say, but I think the plane is landed that you have to be uncomfortable
Yes.
to get this message out there. My question for you, no one talks about this. Everyone sees the thought leader once they've made it and they're like, oh, well, it's easy for them, so I'm not going to try. You went through a lot of uncomfortable moments. Why for you was it so important to get uncomfortable for this message, this mastery that you realized you had to share with the world? Why was it so like, why did you decide to get uncomfortable to get it out there?
When I first started recognizing these 4 levels and creating a little protocol, kind of unfolded organically for me, and it was something that I was just using for myself, in my approach. And the more I was working with children, I started having teachers and other therapists ask me, "Can you show me what you're doing? Because it's really working, and we don't have that success with what we're doing." So I started teaching them, and then they're like, "You need to teach this." And I'm like, "Oh, no, I don't, this I'm good."
Mhm.
And then I started thinking, "You know what? I would love to because I was looking for someone like me, like with the information that I have now. I was looking for that. So if I could help one family, but then of course there's that discomfort of, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get on social media and talk. Who do I think I am? And that's where I believe in divine intervention, and that's where Thought Leader found me. I believe,
Mhm.
and you guys popped up at the perfect time, and I think having you as support showing me the way, giving me the confidence. That helped me make my first post. And that's what it is.
Mhm.
It's just do one thing
Mm,
and then slowly let it unfold and just focus on that one thing.
mm. And why do you, and this could be the answer, what you just said, why do you feel some people don't? This is personal. Like I always say, egos
Mhm.
aside when I ask this question, because if we don't have an open discord about this, we never learn more. Why do you feel there are people out there that have something, like have that brilliance, that calling they were put here to do, but they don't get outside their comfort zone? What do you think stops them?
I think a lot of confidence and fear of what other people will say. Like, what if I get on there and say something wrong and someone criticizes me? And, I had to develop some thick skin. It happened to me right off the bat. And I'm like, you know what? That's okay. Because I realized there's not one way for anything.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bazillion ways. And I had to learn and get real with myself and say, you know what? Am I going to let families out there struggle like I struggled before? Families who are looking for help and they don't know where to turn. Am I going to be that selfish to not get my message out there if it can help just one family? And I would have been grateful if this information was out there. So I decided just put my head down and just go for it. And I did. And it's been wonderful. I've had wonderful experiences with multiple families, many, many families.
Mm. Audra, I am so excited to continue to watch your journey as you continue to help and change more lives and get your message out there. Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
on the Thought Leader podcast today. Those that are listening, today we talked about the topic of relationships, specifically the relationships that we have with our kids that are displaying some behaviors that we could perceive as bad or meltdowns. But what we learn is through frameworks, through simplifying the process of taking in information, digesting it, and then acting, we can help one, understand where our child is, and then two, slowly make the changes needed to rewire and reshape this. And when it comes to getting uncomfortable, you might not have the mastery that Audra has, but you definitely have a message and a mastery in your heart and in your mind. And what I'm learning from you, Audra, today is just realize that one, you're not the only person that's thinking and feeling what you're going through. So put yourself out there to help the other person that's like you. And the other thing is start small. Just do one thing. Audra, we thank you so much for being brave enough, courageous enough, getting uncomfortable and getting on this podcast. And for anyone listening, we will see you in our next episode of the Thought Leader podcast. Take
Thank
care.
you so much, Dylan, for having me.
Not a problem.